right. Tom Lin, welcome to A3C Reads. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to go back to the Young Lions Awards for a second. How cool was that to be in that group of finalists?
It was, I mean, it like, I think we say it a lot. It's an honor just to be in the room, but in that case, like, absolutely 100%, every part of that sentence is true. Specifically, like, even the room itself,
Right?
to like find out that there's this whole back section to the library that, I've literally never seen, was very exciting. And everybody, every one of those books is so like drum tight and precise. It's a real honor to be just like among them. And I had a great time. And I believe it was sponsored. Part of it was sponsored by Shandong Champagne. So I can really assure you that I had an excellent time
Can't go wrong. Can't go wrong with
there.
champagne, right? I know. I feel like I'm learning that champagne and books really do go together, and it seems to be a thing.
It's a great pairing, I think.
Um, well, I'm going to show your book for a second. So if anyone watching has not read it yet, you can see all my little tabs. Um, this is Tom's book. So I I could not get over how epic the scale
Thank you.
was in this novel. I have lots of like kind of craftsmanship questions if you have
Yeah.
the patience for all that. When you were starting out on this journey with writing this novel, I just don't know how do you even begin to tackle something that has this many like twists and turns and there did you have a sense of these like tentpole moments of twists and turns, or did you feel like you knew the characters and they kind of took you on a ride you didn't expect, or you knew the beginning and the end but you didn't expect the middle? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's so funny because I have to answer these questions like as though I know how. But now I'm working on my second book, and I'm like, man, like I did I ever know how to do that? Like, I how did I do that in the first place? I think what it is like for me, writing fiction the main challenge of it is you have to kind of decide amongst this field of infinite possibilities. Like literally anything can happen. And it's it's
Yes.
kind of like it's kind of like when you think like, yeah, like, what should I have for dinner today? Like, yeah, I will just go to bed hungry, for want of deciding. And I think I have like a really similar problem with telling this story. And so one thing that I really found was helpful was research. So I kind of had this kind of really basic idea of, I haven't seen a Western with an Asian American protagonist, who's like front and center. And so I kind of took that kernel and I realized, I had all of this, I had all these different places that he could be, all these different things that he could be involved in. And in order to choose, I ended up doing a lot of research, which is, like that's kind of how I'm trained. Like I was an English major in college. I'm doing a PhD now. So, and I think the fun part about research is that it feels almost as productive as writing, but requires way different brain muscles, and so it's very satisfying. It's kind of like procrastinating in a productive way. But
I
I
love that.
feel
Procrastinating in a productive way. I'm going to use that when I'm researching for pitching on projects. I'm like, guys, I am procrastinating in a productive way.
exactly. I'm thinking about it up here, but I'm not doing any work on it. But I'm getting prepared for it. But yeah, so I would find out all these kind of historical events, and one thing that those facts kind of did for me was it kind of narrowed down this field of possibility. It kind of delineated where he could go, what kind of people would welcome him, what kind of things would he
Mm.
experience, and then I started doing field work, which is just what I call tax deductible vacations along the road of where Ming travels. Because the Interstate 80 actually runs pretty much alongside the old Transcontinental Railroad. Um, there's
Wow.
there's a couple of spots where technology has gotten a little bit better, and so we make a couple of cuts, shortcuts that weren't present back then. But pretty much between Sacramento and I mean definitely Salt Lake, um, you're never more than maybe a dozen or at most 20 miles from the old route. And so that's what I would do. I would drive. I would listen to these like I was listening to a lot of like great courses audiobooks on philosophy at triple speed,
Amazing.
because I was driving back and forth between college and where my family's from in New York. And so I would just kind of get out of the car in the middle of the summer, snap a few pictures, try to like walk as close as I could to the rails. And then finally, you kind of you have this pile of facts and knowledge, and you have to kind of tell a story with that. And for me, I found that what was really helpful was like I wanted to share certain things that I'd learned that I thought were particularly cool, like certain geological facts or certain kind of historical events, and so they ended up working themselves into the plot just kind of because I was thinking about them so much.
That's really cool.
Yeah, so you kind of just
So
have
it's like you were
to
sort of
do everything
excavating
except yeah.
story from research.
Yeah. Because story, I think, is so hard, um, and research is so much easier, like cognitively, because research is is just collecting cool things, and story is like where are all these things from? Like what am I doing with
Right. Yeah, you have to make a plan.
them? Yeah,
You definitely had a plan, or at least felt like you had a plan. Um, the characters also, though, I mean, with the world is so rich, which makes sense that you've done this much research. Like, it doesn't surprise me hearing that you actually physically went there because it feels that way, the way you describe things. And but also the relationship of the characters is so powerful. The prophet who's traveling with Ming, like were there certain relationships in your life that you felt like inspired those things? Or they more were like aspirational relationships, or was it your audiobooks on tape of
yeah.
philosophy or
Yeah, I mean, I think it was almost entirely in my head. The funny thing about writing, especially fiction, is like if as long as you're not writing it down, like what you're doing is experiencing like delusions. You're just walking around thinking about people that don't exist and conversations that never happened. But as soon as you write it down, you're no longer crazy. But I think like I drew inspiration a little bit from people that I know, and like a little bit from family members. And I remember there was this kind of there was this debate, one of the evergreen Twitter debates about whether or not authors are permitted to like borrow bits of other people for use in their fiction.
yeah,
Um, and like for me, where I come down on that is like, I think we always want to believe that we have that ability to just kind of pluck a certain detail from somebody and then just implant it into a different character. But I think what ends up happening is it's never that clean, and so when you go to remove that one little fragment, you always kind of end up pulling out some more of it, because everybody's these characters are and their personalities are like interconnected webs of how they respond and what they like and what they fear. And so if you go and you try to just pull one thing, you usually end up taking more than you mean to. And so
yeah,
I tried to be a little conscious of that, but I did, like my the prophet character is a little bit based on like my actual grandpa, who is who's very old, and he's always been kind of gruff. Um, but like he doesn't speak English, and
wow,
he certainly can't walk as far as the prophet does. And so there, I think you look for beginnings or kind of seeds or seed crystals in the people that you know. So you're not totally generating these personalities like de novo, but I think ultimately like otherwise you'd just be writing a memoir, or otherwise you just say like, well, you should just go talk to this person. And I think
yeah.
the real twist comes from having to go and say like, well, how do I make this set of this little packet of details into something that feels like a full person that goes all the way back.
Yeah, and you did that over and over and over again, though. I mean, you had so
Thank you.
many, one of the notes that I wrote in the book as I was reading was I felt like you took all the characters that were normally sidelined and pulled them to the center. That you took all of these characters that their quirks and, sort of their eccentricities would have normally given them a smaller role in the story. And they felt so fleshed out and felt so whole and complicated. Were you just kind of collecting ideas of characters over time, or was that sort of bunch of eccentric characters something that kind of came together all at the same time?
I definitely I had this idea for a magic show because I wanted to introduce this kind of element of the supernatural, just because I'm like going through these landscapes, and it felt almost like mundane to stop it at the real. So one,
Yeah.
like it's so crazy. Like if you've ever driven through the desert, there,
Oh, yeah.
if you're very unlucky, you get to a point where the AC like isn't really enough for how hot it is outside. And I think in those moments, I'm always like, this is like a different kind of place. Like people shouldn't
Mhm.
be here, you know. And I
Right.
wanted to kind of have some of that wonder, um, in that story. And so I ended up just trying to find supernatural elements to go into it. And so I started with these, because of basic sketches, like this is a superpower, and this is the person that I want to have it. Um, and then you kind of lock them together in a room, and you see like who gets in a fight, and what are they fighting about. And I think you want your characters, you want their responses to feel real, at least to you when you're writing them. So because otherwise, if they're not believable. And so I think as you end up walking through these different scenarios, or these different like bottlenecks, where they have to make a decision, or where they're confronted by a problem, you end up discovering stuff about these characters that you hadn't yet
Mm,
realized. And so it was really like a process of, I would write a scene and I would say, oh, that makes me think of, I should do this other scene. And so I think really at the end, it ended up being more a process of assembly, and kind of patchwork,
interesting.
rather than like going all the way through.
That's so interesting. And what was and the edit process? Like, did you find an editor early on in your process with this novel, or was it something that was kind of fully yours for a long time before someone was weighing in? Or I feel like because the
Yeah.
characters are so specific and the world is so specific, I can only imagine how tricky it would be to have people weighing in on this. Is sort of the underlying thing that I'm saying.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's like, I had the fortune of working with Ben George at Little Brown, who was just fantastic. And very early on in the editing process, like, we had this call, and he was like, I know, like, you're a debut novelist, like, you've never been edited before. And he was like, everybody's got their own like philosophies. Here's mine. And he said, I believe that an editor should read the book more closely than any sane person ever will. And I was like, all
Fair
right,
and true, right?
like let's go for it. And I mean, he really really did do that. And there's some of the details in the book, we spent, like, weeks on trying to figure out, so we said 6 days of travel here, but then in this next chapter you said there's only four
Mm,
sunsets, so, like, what happened in between. um and I don't think anybody has ever, like, sat reading the book and counting the days and nights. But it's so interesting to, like, kind of have someone else, like, step into this project, this kind of very solitary antisocial world that you've built, and kind of say, well, have you noticed, these two things don't really quite line up, or like this doesn't really connect with that. And I think it ultimately comes down to trust, that you have to believe that, they're also there because they kind of have an idea of what it's going to be in the end, that they share with you, and so you're working toward building this thing together. And so it really does begin to feel like a team effort. And then ultimately, like, I think there's a point where they just come over and they're like, "You're done. Like, hand it over. Like, you're finished."
wow. So like the editor really sort of had a sense with you, like that this is complete at some point.
Yeah. I mean, there's that, and there's also like the deadline, right? Because there's like this kind of very like material conditions that are needing to line up. Like, the book needs to be printed, and like they've got to get the shipments out,
Yep.
and all these sellers have to
Yep.
buy it. And so, like, we want to keep tinkering on it, but at a certain point they're like, like, we have to move on to the next step. And I think that is honestly a mercy, because I mean, even now, like, if I do readings, I'll edit on the fly when I read,
Right.
because, like, I'm
I was
not
gonna say
quite, you know
I feel like every time I write anything and I press send, I immediately see it differently, and I'm like, "Why would I send
oh
that?
yeah, oh
I can't believe I
absolutely.
sent that." Like,
I have a 10-second delay that, on my mail app, that's like programmed. So
"Oh,
when I hit send,
wow.
it gives me a little countdown for 10 seconds where I can undo it, like, no penalty. And I
How do
use
you do
that
that?
feature all the time.
Wait,
Okay,
I have to implement this.
okay,
How is this possible?"
I promise I'm not a shill for this company. It's like this German company called Mail Butler, that
Wait,
integrates
mail
with.
butler.
I have a Mac, and I click send, and it says, like, all right, like, we know you click send. Why don't you take send, like, 10 seconds, just, like, you know, just double check. And, like, I could just do it with a post-it, I guess, on my screen that says, like, is everything right? But I use
No,
that
it
feature.
changes. You see it differently as soon as you
Oh yeah,
press send. That button changes everything. I swear the button creates the like
I
typos.
I 100% agree. You're like, how did that get in there? It's I wish I had that 10-second undo timer for everything I do in life.
God, wouldn't life be better?
Just like, oh, actually, I'll do that one again.
Hang on, redo. Wow, I think you might have just changed my life, Tom.
You ready for
That's really
incredibly
cool.
correct emails?
So wait, so tell me a little bit about like your journey to now. Did you grow up knowing you wanted to write? Were you writing as a kid? Were you fascinated with literature? What was your journey to getting this novel published?
Yeah, I mean, so I was born in Beijing, and then I was the son of a orthopedic surgeon and a my mom was like a general doctor, and now she's a nurse in America, and my dad is a surgeon in China still. Um,
Wow.
and so they wanted me to be a doctor as well,
No way.
believe it or not. Um,
Can't imagine why.
so like kind of very early on in my childhood, my parents were both busy. We were like a new immigrant family, and so they were working all the time. And so when I finished school, they wouldn't be done with work yet. So we actually had a system where like I would just go to Queen's Library in Flushing, and I would go to the children's room in the back, and I would just sit there and read until they came to get me. And that was pretty much how I taught myself English. So actually, and there still are. The frequency is going down, but there still are a lot of words that I have only ever seen and kind of learned like visually, but I've
Wow.
never actually heard or even tried to say. And the unfortunate thing is like now I'm getting to the position where like when I mispronounce a word, like sometimes people will assume like, oh, that's how it's pronounced, and I always have to be like, I'm not sure about that. Like one that I'm not sure about it still is like is it hegemon or is like hegemony? Like why does the stress change? I'm not sure. I've never really bothered to look it
I don't think I've ever seen that word said that word out loud either.
up.
So I'm not weighing in on that one.
Yeah, but so I pretty much learned English by reading these books and reading these stories, and I always wanted to tell stories, and I did a lot as a kid, to whoever was patient enough to listen. Um, and the whole time I was like, and then I'm going to be a doctor. Like I'm just going to get this little story writing thing. Like I'm going to get this out of my system, and I'll be a doctor. And then I went to college, and I was an English major. And then I told my
Did you go to
parents,
college in America or did you go to
yeah,
college in
I went
China?
to Pomona, first time in
Oh,
California.
great.
Um,
Wow. And can
and
I
I
go
was
back
just,
one for
yeah,
1 second and ask another? So you're saying you learned English by reading in this library in China, right?
no, no,
So,
this was in
oh,
Queens.
here. Oh,
Yeah,
it's here. So you were born in China, and then when you
yeah,
came here,
yeah.
okay, I understand.
That
I was
was
like, wow,
yeah, it's
what's
free
this English
childcare.
library doing in China?
Yeah, so I pretty much spent I think probably like ages 4 to 12, like many days per week, many hours per day in the library.
Wow.
Um, and I like really loved telling stories. I really loved writing things, and I tried several times to write books. I so Ming is actually my third book length like project.
Wow.
Um, the first two are really bad, and I hope that they are destroyed. Like I haven't even bothered to see if they're still on the hard drive.
Are you
Um,
sure they're really bad, or are you just being hard on yourself?
I think they are genuinely bad. Which I like,
I
but
just
I think they're genuinely bad. But I go to college and I was an English major and I was telling my parents, I'll graduate, and then I'll go to night school for medicine, and then I'll go to med school and be a doctor. And yeah, at this point, I think like credit to them. I think we all understood that it was kind of a fiction that we were telling ourselves. And I actually up until I signed the book contract to get it published, I was saying, and then I'll be a doctor.
wow.
Um,
Wow.
luckily, I think as a family, we're all now pretty in agreement that I don't have to be a
They're
doctor after
supporting the
this.
fact that this is not in the cards.
But I always really, really want to tell stories. It kind of feels like saying, "Oh, when I grow up, I want to be an astronaut," and then suddenly one day someone's like, "You're an astronaut." It
Yeah.
feels totally. It's like that level of impossibility.
Yeah.
And that's why I didn't study creative writing in college. I studied English criticism because I figured like it's a fool's errand to try to like write a novel and be an author. So
Wow.
I'll just try to be as close to books as I can, from the other side, from the critical side. So I
That
think I
must have
really
given
lucked
you a
out.
really interesting perspective though on like as you were journeying through the writing process. Like if you literally studied how to critique writing and
Yeah.
critique literature and storytelling, it must be interesting to have that insight as you're approaching the actual storytelling. I mean, I don't feel that in the writing. I don't feel you judging yourself in the writing, but I just feel like it must have been helpful to at least know what people are looking at when they're critiquing something.
Yeah, and I think it also like it feels, I'm doing analytical and creative work at the moment, for because I'm in grad school, and I honestly think like it's like taking a break. It's like
Mm,
doing something with one arm and then using the other arm. Because I think they use two different modes of thinking, and so it's
yeah.
actually it feels quite different. It just happens to be about the same thing. Um, but I think like especially when I'm writing, I try not to think about how it'll be received or how it'll be critiqued, but I still have all of these kinds of like analytical or philosophical texts that I'm thinking about as I'm writing,
Mhm.
and I think I'm kind of thinking about myself in this lazy school of writing where like you actually don't really have to think too hard about anything as long as you assemble all the pieces in your brain, like stuff will leak out into what you're writing, like the osmotic theory of writing. um
Sure, yeah, like you put it all in, you've done all the research,
yeah.
and somehow it's just gonna pour all out. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is it's just like a moderately more advanced iteration of like I'll go to sleep and I'll put my French textbook under my pillow so that the knowledge will leak through the pages in time for my test
Let's be
tomorrow.
fair for a second. It's a little bit more of like the 10,000 hour thing. I feel like if you're consuming something on that level for that long, I feel like, you know, you're undercutting the hard work that you've done over all those years of putting all of that storytelling inside of you. When you talk about the publisher stuff, especially after having two you know, full length novels that you decided not to pursue having published. What does that journey look like? Because, you know, for just the reader, we're like these books appear, you know, like
Yeah,
and we're learning, I'm learning as a producer, you know, almost every time, even when it's super early that I go to try to option something, they're like, "Oh, they option that before the publisher even engaged." And I'm like, "How? What?"
yeah,
You know, so
yeah.
what for someone who is this is your debut novel, right? So for someone who's having their debut moment, what does that process look like? I feel like a lot of our listeners and our folks who like read along with us are curious about writing themselves, and so that feels like a big mystery to everybody.
Yeah, I mean I would say in general it is more mundane than you want it to be. So for instance, like like we all use Microsoft Word, but those of us who believe that spending a little bit of money can make them more creative might purchase the software. So I got this thing called Scrivener, which like is designed for writing books, and like people say they use it a lot for books, and so I put the whole thing together in this app. And then, when we're working on it for like official edits with a real official publisher, like we're just sending a Word document like back and forth, like it's track changes, like it's very banal, and the final thing that goes out is a Word document.
Yeah,
And so there's a point at which I think for me, there's a point at which like it becomes absolutely surreal, and that's when a box of the galleys shows up at your door. Um,
wow,
and you're like, oh, like this thing that I've been scrolling through is on my computer is actually people are gonna come to it as a book and no longer as like a thing that I'm working on. And
yeah,
I think there's a lot of I'm working on a thing. Here's a thing that I'm working on. For the whole time that I was working on the project, it was saved in my computer as working title Western. Um,
oh, interesting.
so I didn't actually get around to naming it until I felt done with it. Um, but yeah, so I was lucky enough to connect with an agent who's spectacular. Her name's Lisa Queen, and she sent it out to a couple of editors, and I think we got a couple of we'll pass on this, and then Little Brown snapped it up, and then I think we finished up all the like legal stuff in like maybe March 2020, early March 2020,
Yeah,
and then coronavirus, and so like we had this kind of completely virtualized publishing experience that ended up with,
Jeez.
and the book got published in 21, like June 21. And we were beginning to come out of the first of many false starts. We were beginning to come out of isolation.
Yep.
Um, but I think, so I don't think my experience was typical in many ways, but I also think like, because you often get this question, like what's it like for a debut novelist? And sometimes you get invited to speak on panels for like, like what's the publishing process like? And it's pretty funny because it's as though you're trying to get, by averaging everybody's responses, like, oh, like what is it like the first time you drive a car? Like you only do that once, and like it's different
Right.
for everybody. And yet we're just like we're pooling our notes. We're trying to figure out like, well, what's the average experience like? But for me, it was I was lucky enough to have a team that I really trusted, that I felt really had my back, and we were all just working on this like, this little thing that I was working on, this little book, and then finally, like, cover gets made for it. It's incredible. Like the book comes in the box, and then all of a sudden people are like, oh, this book that you wrote. And so it's
So
totally surreal.
wild. It just
It's
gotta be
totally surreal.
so crazy. And this is all just like ideas from your head that are suddenly like a tangible thing that other people like carry around with them.
it's
That's
it's
so
it's
wild.
wild. I mean, I can tell you there is one group of people who their opinion of me doesn't change when I say that, and that's the students that I teach. Because I'll introduce it. I'll say, my name's Tom Lin. I'm your instructor. Um, I'm teaching. So last year I was teaching introduction to composition, like university writing. And I was like, I've Tom Lin. I'm a grad student. Wrote a book. It like got a lot of nice reviews. And that's it for me. And then I have a student who raises his hand and he says, okay, so we only have one essay due this quarter. We only have one. Like no one blinks. It doesn't even register. And so after
He's
that,
just
I'm
like, who cares about the book?
just like, okay, so I only see one essay on the syllabus. Is that real? um, so that'll keep
Oh
you
my
humble.
god. That's amazing. Um, I also wanted to ask, like, what do you have what is your sort of reach of different inspirations? Because it feels there's a lot of poetry in your writing, and I'm curious if that has to do with your bilingual situation in terms of like, I certainly don't know, how to speak another language, so I don't know if that would affect my way of putting words together. But there's just such beautiful poetry, and there's
Thank
sentences
you.
that are just, it was dangerous to go lurking in memory. At length, the sun dropped to the surface of the lake and pressed a while against its own reflection before slipping under. It just, I could go. I have pages of these of quotes like this, where this is not normal. Like it's very rare to come across, and but also to come across writing like this that is so additive to the story. Like it never took me out of the story. It never distracted me. It never felt forced. It felt like that poetry was very baked into the way that you write. Are you a poetry reader? Do you have favorite poets? Or is this just something that was kind of in your life history?
I do really like poetry. I always I really admire poets because they have so much less space to do something cool, and it's invariably cooler than I feel like a lot of the stuff that I try to write. I do really like there's one poet that I really love, W.S. Merwin, who actually
Mm,
recently passed. And I actually have like I have the Essential W.S. Merwin. I have a couple of his later volumes, and he also actually translated Dante's Purgatorio, which is
no way.
which is like a really kind of I think poets should do that more. Like translate old verse. But so it's Merwin, but it's also Purgatory.
Wow.
And so that was a real trip to read. But I do really like poetry. I don't know if it has much to do with my bilingualism. I think I speak Chinese at a maybe second grade level. Um, because we left China when I was still pretty young, and then I went to English speaking
Yep.
schools. But one interesting thing that'll happen, especially when I was younger, is like my parents would get very mad at me, and I would be yelling back at them in English, and they'd be yelling at me in Chinese. And then there was a point at which, because I
It's a
learned
great scene, by the
Chinese,
way.
it's imagine the setup. But I learned it only from my parents, right, who would never use any bad words around me or never use any curse words or slang. But when they really got, when they finally got, hit their limit, they would start cursing me out in Chinese, and I didn't know any of these words. And so it suddenly became, it was almost as if there was a neutral gear beyond six that I could shift into, where I just had to sit and just like listen to this kind of, very
Sounds.
angry sound. Yeah, but I had no idea what it meant. And I
It's
took
probably
a
therapeutic for any parent to
oh
just be
yeah
able to swear in an unknown language and like just get it
oh
all
yeah
out.
and that sounds pretty bad, mom, and I'm sure I am that, and I'll do better. Um, I love my parents, but I took this Chinese for heritage learners class at Davis because I had to get a second modern language for my PhD. And it was me and a bunch of freshmen. And I would say I took that for a year. We met every weekday for an hour, and I would say I retained maybe 15% of everything that I had.
Really?
I just have a really hard time holding on to languages. Um,
I agree. I'm the same way. It's interesting that you say that because I feel like I'm really struggling to learn Spanish, and I know a lot of words. I know I
oh
can
yeah,
conjugate a
yeah,
lot of verbs. Like I have a lot of just like pieces of it, but to actually speak, I get so tongue tied. I get so nervous. I feel like I always grab the wrong verb. I just
yeah.
and it was interesting because I do want to take this person up on it. I won't reveal who it is right now, but I was meeting with an actor for a project, and he said you should wake up in the morning and pay attention to every little thing that you do. It was like, I sit up, I pull the sheet back, I put my feet on the ground, I walk to the bathroom, I turn the faucet on. He was like, and just make a list of things that you do in the day and translate just that list. And he was like, and then challenge yourself to learn, I think it was two verbs and five nouns every day from that like translated list. He was like, because those are things you do every day and you're
Yeah.
interested in them because it's things that actually impact you. And I was like, oh man, I really have to do this. I was like, anyway, I don't know if that applies to Chinese for
Oh,
you
I
or
mean,
not, but
like
I'm
you
with
do
you.
all
It
those.
slides right through me.
They're always here's like the first 50 words that you'll need to know, and it's always like bread, and you're like how often do I talk about bread? Just in real life,
Yeah.
I remember I visited my cousin in China when I was a kid, and she was learning English, and her strategy was to write the English word of like common household items and stuff on post-its and put them all
Mm.
over on the thing. And so,
Oh, and they were everywhere.
it's because you open it, and you reach for the door, and it's like door handle, and you close it, and it's like a coat hook. Um,
Yeah, I feel like that might work too. I'm gonna be doing all these hacks where I'm just have Spanish words everywhere in the house, and I'm just trying my best. Um, all right, so sorry, we got distracted from our poetry, but so this is a little bit more of a I don't know, not scandalous topic, but like Ming is a violent man, and he's got
oh yeah,
this interesting like drive of vengeance, but he also you were able to still capture such a relatability in him. I don't know that I've ever felt that connected to a violent character. I think that that's always been sort of off-putting to me in the past just because I don't understand it. I don't feel like I have those impulses. So when I was reading it, I was really taken aback by this interesting mixture um of sort of this empathetic spirit or this really like heart-filled spirit that was also um raised to be violent. Like all he knew was,
yeah.
he was just living what he knew. So, what was your approach to kind of walking out the balance to all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think violence is, for me. It was important to include violence, and also in that quantity, because I did want to hit that kind of major point of the Western, which is like, you exit civilization, you go into this kind of
Yes.
wild frontier, where the only laws that govern you are, how much force can you apply to another body, and how much can you make your own will apparent. And that comes with a lot of baggage, and so I think one thing that I wanted to kind of do with the violence is that like these murders, like they do end up weighing on him, and
Mm,
even though he's been trained, he's been raised not to do it, not to like kind of think about it too much, but at the end of it, I think like it becomes clear that he's operating out of this kind of web of obligation, or this feeling of necessity, rather than any kind of actual hatred or malice in his heart. Um,
Sure.
and I think, there's a way that I think you can treat violence, and you can depict violence, especially in stories, where it's almost like skipping a stone over water. If you hit it fast enough with enough momentum, you can actually skip over like the parts of violence that are really upsetting for anyone to think about, which is like, like what is it actually like to end a life? Like what is it actually like to visit death on somebody? But if you hit it with enough momentum, it becomes this kind of cinematic gloss of like
Mm,
pure action and pure activity. And so one thing that I really tried to do was I didn't want to slow down and linger on any scenes of violence, because I think what I wanted to do was preserve this sense of like, we're going forward. It's just actions. We're kind of doing this
mm,
ritualized action, which is violent as it looks, but we never have to feel any of it because we're skipping right over the surface. And I think when we see Ming in kind of quieter moments, we kind of visit that introspection, and it does become troubling. And I think
yeah.
it's like I personally am pretty squeamish about violence. We actually had a rat that's been living in the tree right next to our house. It built a nest, and I like have been really reluctant to do anything about it. But finally, I did set out a trap, and like I caught it, and like that's bothered me, like
Oh
since I had to
God,
throw it out.
it's so
You
hard.
know,
I know. I mean, it's so hard. I can't. It's interesting to face the sort of cycles of life sometimes. The world was different at the time that this was set, even, but it's like you see anything about farming or
oh yeah,
ranching, and you realize that the cycle of life is just like sort of really facing us at all times in a way that most of us are kind of looking past, sort of in the
yeah,
way you're saying, like in the skipping the stone. It's like we're not saying like, well, what happened to this chicken before it ended up on my plate. So but that is sort of baked into the cycle of things, and but it's interesting to look at it from that perspective. It made me think a lot about too, just like when kids are raised in violent cultures, or violent
yeah,
situations. If kids are raised inside of a gang, or if they're raised in a country that's in civil war, or where it's like this, that Ming has this interesting um representation for someone who would have gone through something like that, where it's like if all you've ever known is since you were 7 years old, someone's putting a gun in your hand, or telling you that the way you're going to survive and have a meal tomorrow is to do something violent, then that's what life becomes, and it's really hard to imagine that reality. And it also makes me realize how privileged any of us are to not have to live that way, or to have grown up that way. um but yeah, he's really fascinating in that way, and there's just such a tenderness in him, and also the ferocity with which he loves. Is it Ada or Ada? Now I
I've
don't know how to say things out loud.
I've always said Ada. I think, yeah,
Ada.
Ada.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, he has such a impassioned love for her, so it's really interesting to really look at the many different sides of this man that walk out through this whole Western novel.
yeah. And I think the other thing, is you're trying to think about like violence in this kind of Western context, and all these different connections that it has with like masculinity and kind of
Mm,
dominance, and especially in the context of these, the older westerns that we would tell ourselves, that kind of not only did the job of explaining, how the West was won, right, which kind of takes as a presumption like that the West was something which needed to be won, and specifically, whom by and with
yeah,
what means, but kind of trying to take that violence and kind of lift it out of that context and put it all in this kind of person who is not usually in that story, I think for me was very interesting, because it almost, the Western is this, it's such an American genre, like
yep,
it's really like it's a kind of story that like we came up with ourselves, and like everybody loves it, and one of the things that like it does so well is this unspoken belief that like there is, you can engineer, or you can find yourself in a situation where like the only thing that counts is what you do in the now with yourself, like, this total self-reliance, or like total saturated action,
yep,
um and as a genre, it's always been directed towards the project of American imperialism. Like cowboys and Indians. Like there's always this
Yeah.
whole kind of like mechanism that's been supporting it. And what I want to do is kind of take that and just say like, well, what else can this machine do for us? Like is it really just like an empowerment fixture dedicated to this one purpose, or can it be molded and moved and deformed and to for other ends? But I think, especially for Ming as like a violent character, you're with him for so long, and it's hard to write a character that readers hate genuinely start to finish.
Right.
Like
Yes, of course. Yeah.
it's not just hard for the reader, it's also hard for like you who are writing it, because you're like, oh, this guy sucks. you know so you want to give people something to hold on to, and I think that's one thing that the Western does really well, which is this kind of like it does kind of suggest like, oh, were you in this situation, you would do the same, like you would do just as
Yeah.
well. Like we
Yep.
all have
Yeah,
this
you're
little
it's
bit
always
in
life or
us.
death. The stakes are so high,
Exactly.
and yeah. Um, it also it feels like this is very much a journey of someone letting go, and
Yeah.
what I sort of took from it in the end was that, you kind of can't fully move forward until you've completely faced your past, which is, I think, something that women talk a lot about, and it's not something that men always embrace, in storytelling. And so I think it's really interesting that you have this hyper masculine, violent man who's complicated and complex and full and real and all this stuff, but that like it feels like this is about him coming to the realization of having to sort of face everything to be able to move into a new place.
Yeah,
Am
I
I
think
am I projecting that, or am I reading that
I think
right?
I think that's absolutely a part of it, which is it's this like I think about maybe 2/3 of the way through, like he kind of even gets that, where he's like, like I just have to do it. He doesn't
Yeah.
really feel that he has a choice. He doesn't even really want to do it anymore. But he understands that he's in this kind of cross-linked web of obligations and things that he must do, not for himself,
Yeah.
but for his to secure his own place in the world. And I often get asked, like, will there be a sequel? And I actually, for me, the answer is no, because I think, for me, the story is like Ming is earning his right to self-determine his future. And at the very end, like,
Mm,
that's the gift that he gets, is like, he gets to decide
mm.
what's next for him. He doesn't have to check lists. He doesn't have anything like holding over from his old life. He's done. He gets to pick what he has to do next. And so it almost feels unfair for me as the author to kind of pull him back and say, hey, actually, I need you for another story. You've got more
You
things
can
to do.
always do a prequel.
Exactly. Exactly. You can always go back in time.
Or spin-offs. There's a lot of good characters in there that could have spin-offs. That's really cool. Well, I just had such a great time going on this adventure. I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I started reading the novel, and I think that I can't believe it's a debut novel. Like, I think it's just spectacular. I'm just
Thank
a
you.
reader. I'm no fancy critic or anything, but it was really just a spectacular journey. And so you said you're working on a second novel now. How is that
Yes.
coming along? How are you feeling?
It's slow. Um, I I often say that I find writing excruciating, and I
Mm,
do. And sometimes, sometimes people are like, "Oh, yeah, but rewarding too, right?" And I'm always like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, that as well." But like in the moment, it's always like, why do I do this? Like sometimes. Um, so I have a goal of 600 words per day,
wow,
um, and I don't. I would say it's probably like I'm batting maybe 300 on that goal. Um,
got it.
I think it's coming along. It's about an immigrant family in the late 1970s or so, who come to America and actually end up trying to start this kind of ranch slash farm, and then there's some other stuff that goes on.
Oh,
um,
wow.
and I'm being vague because I don't really know yet either. So.
Yeah, it hasn't presented itself fully yet. No, I totally understand, and no pressure. I'm just excited to know that there's going to be another
Yeah,
Tom Lin book
but
to read one of these days.
I am working on it. Promise.
That's awesome. That's cool. So my last thing that I always ask everyone is, what's the best advice anyone's ever given you?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say I really hated to hear this, but I think it was the most helpful thing, was finish the thing you're working on. Um, for so many reasons. I mean, the first reason is like I think when I was a kid, I played piano involuntarily. My parents made me, and one of the strategies that we did was you would play a piece, and then whenever you messed up, you would start again at the beginning, and so that way you get more and more
Oh,
practice. But what that ends up doing is you have an incredibly well practiced, perfect beginning, and the quality goes down as you get further and further on into the song. And I think, especially with writers or anyone who's like kind of working on a creative project, like starting something is so fun. Like having an idea is so fun, and it's the finishing that's really the slog. And
oh,
unfortunately, like you have to have something done if you want it to go anywhere. Um,
yeah,
and so I think you just have to get practice finishing as much practice as you have starting something. Um, and I think it also requires a certain amount of like you have to if you think to yourself I'm going to finish this, like you have to tie up a bunch of loose ends that like you might have been leaving kind of open just because you didn't have to deal with them yet. Like
yeah,
it forces a lot of, I think, really good activity, and the downside is like it sucks.
yeah,
Finishing
yeah.
is so hard, and I heard that advice and I was like, I don't want to do that, but I think it is actually the best advice that I've gotten, which is just finish the
Just
thing.
finish. Just finish the thing. All right. Well, we're gonna just finish this interview.
Get some practice
Uh,
closing up.
yeah, exactly. Well, thank you again so much. I really really recommend your book. We can't wait to highlight it on our all of our channels. So hopefully, lots of people will be joining me in the conversation about this,
I'm
and
really
we
excited. I hope
will
everybody likes it.
we'll be looking forward to the next one.
Me too.